Well, today I'm joined by Nora Conklin, who's the principal analyst for ABM at Forrester. Nora, thanks so much for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thanks so much.
Well, today's episode is going to be a little bit different, actually, because normally on Let's Talk ABM, we talk to ABM practitioners, ABM thought leaders who are running ABM campaigns within quite well-known companies across the world. But today we're going to be looking and talking to somebody who's on the other side of the fence from an analyst point of view, from a research point of view, and obviously working at Forrester, very well-known company. And I think we'll have a chance to talk about some things a little bit different, to get a little bit of a different perspective on ABM, and to lift the lid a little bit on what you're hearing in the market, what your customers and what the market are telling you. And so it's going to be a very different episode and a very interesting episode. So Nora, thanks for joining. So let's kick off with a question around your work there at Forrester. So principal analyst at ABM, tell us a little bit more. What does your typical week look like?
Yeah, as a principal analyst, my role is sort of comprised of two main responsibilities. So one being on the research side, conducting surveys or helping to shape our surveys, talking, as you mentioned already, to clients, practitioners to get a sense of where the market is now, as well as looking ahead to what's around the corner, how things are developing, what our clients need to be prepared for. So that's one big area. And the other is working directly with clients. So that looks a lot of different ways in things like workshops or strategy sessions, or in just recurrent conversations where I meet with clients directly to either review their work, go through best practices, or in working sessions sometimes if they're working on an engagement plan or putting together a dashboard or things of that nature, which also overlaps a bit with the research, since the research is not just about state of the market or looking ahead, but also how to best practice, that sort of guidance to where, how should you be working with different teams or tackling certain challenges just in the day-to-day of being a demand and ABM marketer. So typical week is tough to say. I think from week to week, it's usually heavy on one or the other, but I think in the aggregate, it's about half and half of my time is spent in each area.
Good stuff. And so part of your role is to be a little bit of a fly on the wall, really, and to see what's happening within these companies, and then to obviously either advise or to help them shape some of their ABM strategy and and some of their thinking, right?
Absolutely. And our clients really run the gamut. We have, especially with myself focusing on ABM, I'm talking to clients of all shapes and sizes, some that are very large and complex and mature in their ABM efforts, thinking about really that leading edge. How do we evolve, or are we optimized in the way we need to be? Others that are either just starting out, where really a concerted ABM effort is new to them, or they're trying to evolve, if they had fits and starts or changes in the organization with their teams or strategies. So it does run the gamut, really, of what we're looking at and who we're speaking with, also and working with directly as clients.
Yeah, so that leads nicely into one of the things that we were talking about before we started this recording. We were talking about the convergence of ABM and demand generation. And I think there was a few kind of observations that you made around that subject of convergence. If you don't mind, let's break down what we were talking about a little bit to share with the audience. I think one of the things you were saying was that many companies have demand generation teams. Some companies have ABM teams. I think after there are more companies with demand gen teams and ABM teams. And obviously many more people are thinking about generating and creating ABM teams. What do you see, or how do you see this convergence? I.e., there has been that kind of debate, ABM is not demand gen is not ABM, etc. But you're seeing something different. What are you seeing?
Yeah, at Forrester for years now, we've been tracking this trend towards convergence, meaning that really the best of demand and best of ABM are sort of coming together. I was speaking about this actually at our most recent B2B summit a few months ago, where there's a few different ways we talk about it, myself and my colleagues, but it's really that ABM won. It's proven itself to be the more successful approach. Of course, the question has always been about focus and about scale. Where are the right places to invest, more resource, more effort, more attention, more personalization, et cetera. But also how can we do this to the greatest extent possible? And there's I think traditionally been a bit of a hard wall, if you will, there, that there were kind of confines on how personal you could get, how much you could scale, how much focus was really feasible with different organizations. And in recent years, just with the scale of technology, the level of data and insights that are being brought to market, and what we see also becoming really entrenched, they're not leading edge, they're really established in all manner of different B2B organizations. That those are really changing the conversation about how much scale can be achieved. But also the focus question is just as important. What really should we personalize, getting into the minds of the accounts and the buyers within the accounts, refining our focus around opportunities within the accounts. All of that is still, I think, an area that really deserves a lot of attention and focus from organizations. And it's interesting because prior to joining Forrester as an analyst, I was a client of Forrester's, but I always was responsible for both demand and ABM, even though I worked in a few different organizations with different target audiences. Some were much more focused, where there really were just a few accounts that the bulk of our revenue came from, and we were really focused not only on new business, but on retention, post-sale, et cetera. And others that were a little wider scale and a bit more of what you would call, I guess, a demand motion, where there were, deal sizes that looked relatively similar, and a wider array of clients that we would serve. But ultimately the same principles apply. It's really, and that's something I try to emphasize with clients as well. I see a lot of folks that are focused on, especially as I talk about starting out or evolving, is this a one-to-one or a one-to-few or a one-to-many effort, where really the question is not the number as what's a few and what's many. Obviously that's relative depending on the different organizations and who you're serving. Really the question is how proactive and how personal are we going to get to speaking to this particular account and these particular buyers. So there's that answer is different for every organization who you're working with, how unique and different your micro segments are. That's really where the work comes in to tailor ABM efforts to the best effect for organizations. And that's what really guides, especially as you talk about, do we have a separate team? Do we have a demand team? Do we have an ABM team? Do we have different, roles focused in different areas? There isn't one ideal state. Just there's not one perfect form of ABM that everyone should be doing. And there's not one ideal org structure, even though I know it would be great to have that, right? A lot of people just want to say, okay, tell me how to do it and I'll fill it, I'll follow the steps or fill in the blanks. But it really depends how you're structured. For example, I've spoken with some practitioners that go to market completely differently in certain regions or countries. Their buyers are totally different. Their brand perception is totally different. The portfolio is different in terms of what they sell. So in that sort of a mode, it makes sense to carve out that focus. So it's very personal, and that's something I always try to emphasize as a focus for clients that are thinking about how to invest in ABM. Not just starting out, but also what's the right ideal state for your organization and where ultimately you want to be with your customers and those that you work with.
Fascinating. There's one thing you said at the very beginning of that piece. You said ABM has won.
Yeah.
Which almost like you're saying kind of ABM has won the argument. Is that almost what you're saying? Is that almost what you're saying?
Yeah, argument, I don't know, arm wrestling. There's, like I said, there's a number of different ways that we've talked about it. One of my colleagues, the way he would put it is that ABM ate demand. It sort of took over. I talk about it sometimes as the way it always registers in my mind is that it's kind of polluted the water. It's everywhere now, and so it's taken on, I think, much more of the capabilities that traditionally fell within a demand, thinking about self-guided touch points, thinking about digital elements, content targeting. All of that really has now been impacted by ABM, whether or not folks are actively investing in ABM or not, through the technologies and all the best practices. I think ABM, the approach of ABM has infiltrated demand at large, is sort of the way that I would describe it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure we might reach this kind of question a bit later, but you could also argue that as using the word polluted, as ABM has kind of polluted the waters there are so many companies who are doing ABM, but actually it's not really ABM, and it's kind of like a muddied to continue the theme around murkiness.
Right.
It's kind of murky waters of, is it demand, is it industry marketing, is it target account marketing, is it industry marketing? It's a bit of a muddle out there at the moment. But just one very very briefly, you mentioned before, Nora, that you were looking after demand gen and ABM in previous companies before you joined Forrester. And so you had your hands dirty, so to speak, doing both. If you had to kind of objectively look at each as a kind of unique case, what would you say? If somebody said to you, "Hey, what do I do?" What would you say the pros and cons? Very very briefly, what would you say the pros and cons of demand gen versus ABM?
Yeah, I think it's, again, going back to what really makes sense from the business strategy. When you look at your growth plan, your revenue targets, does that come from just a few? Are there some that really stand out, have an outsized impact on achieving that goal, or where you're going to be in 3 years versus a wider set of audiences? I really think the why is kind of behind what organizations should invest in. But in terms of pros and cons of how to go about each, I think that the real kind of crux of where ABM is, has won, is more successful, is in thinking, I have a former colleague who always used to say, if I could rename ABM, I would call it insights driven marketing, really looking at the account, the buyers within the account, the nature of the opportunities within the account as the North Star for what you invest in from a marketing perspective, from a sales perspective. You're thinking about the entire revenue engine oriented around what do these accounts need? What do these buyers within these accounts need? Where I think the demand approach is typically or traditionally, right, who's buying now, that you're juggling and you're trying really to capture active demand. And that is a balancing act. I think when we talk about convergence or ABM taking everything over, it's kind of butting up against that question. Yes, there are some that are actively shopping or in market now, but are we better served to put investments over the longer term into those who are a strong fit but might not be actively shopping now? And conversely, just because there are really what we could foresee as very strong customers that would retain, with expansion potential, we have reason to believe they'd be advocates for us, looking at all of those kind of post-sale and the importance of lifetime value of customers and prospects that you're focused on. The flip side of the coin, of course, is, well, what if those are all long-term, right? That we could be talking, a year plus out for a deal to actually hit, or for them to be ready to speak to a seller and proceed, with a contract or whatever it might be. So the flip side of the coin is, well, what about people who are shopping now that may not be the cream of the crop, but they're acceptable, right? They're somewhat of a good fit. So that's really where, and our most, advanced clients are really thinking on those terms, kind of dialing up, their measures of fit strength, for a particular offering or across their portfolios, versus, what are the indicators that we see that they're conducting research in this area, they're checking things out, or they're actually in market looking for a solution, or they're working with a competitor now, but that contract's coming up, whatever the kind of indicators of a purchase cycle might be, and evaluating their investments accordingly, right? How much do we put on those that might be a little farther down, but are, we see that they're buying now and we want to play in that space, versus how much do we invest in those that may show less intent at this moment, but could pay off in years to come.
Yeah, no, I think some good points there. One thing you were saying there about demand generation or capturing demand, I always find it interesting that kind of, the term demand generation is a little bit of an oxymoron. So, and there's a whole debate going on, which, you may have seen on LinkedIn, people talking about, well, you can't you can't create, you can't generate demand. It's either there or it's not there. And it's an interesting debate. And I think you were talking there about, capturing that demand that exists out there. And so maybe demand capture is perhaps a better term than demand generation, right?
Right. And the way I like to talk about it is demand capture versus seeding demand, which is, generating demand. It's more about positioning or telling the story. For those who are familiar with Forrester's buying journey research, it starts with challenging the status quo, right? There's a problem, or there's an opportunity, or there's a different way to do things. So there's certainly room to play in telling that story, particularly from that account-based approach, where it's not necessarily based on where they are in a deal cycle. It's based on who they are, their needs, the potential ahead of that. So it's kind of investments and all the efforts to personalize and everything's sort of dialed in more on that scale.
Yeah. One thing, Nora, I saw about that, which I thought was fascinating, was when somebody was talking about why you cannot generate demand. They talked about the fact that what you actually need to happen is something internal needs to happen within the company or within the person or the group, the buying group. Whether it's an internal change in the company, a new CEO, there's a regulatory change, there's an environmental change, a macro change, or a competitor change, something changes inside the company. And that change is the catalyst to make your team go and look for a way to solve that problem that problem or that opportunity that is being presented by that change. So, whether it was, I'm sure a lot of people made a lot of money back in 2000 with the whole kind of, IT change. And so that was obviously, there wasn't a whole bunch of people generating demand about you must change your computer system, because no, there was a problem that they recognized internally, and off people went and tried to find a solution. So let's talk about another thing you said to me, which I thought was fascinating. Because generally, when we talk about ABM, we kind of say that ABM is an ABM without sales. Mm-hmm. And we talk about sales alignment, marketing sales alignment. We all know that is a must have, and without that, you haven't got ABM. We know that. We know that it just can't work. It's a team sport, and we know that it will fail without that team element. But one thing you were saying was actually from some of your conversations that you're having with customers, it's kind of moving on a little bit more. ABM's moving on a little bit more from that. And you were saying to me, I think you were saying to me, it's more about how do you help buyers buy?
Right.
Tell us more about that thinking, rather than kind of, the sales element, but no, we're actually here to help buyers buy.
Absolutely. And I think traditionally ABM was sort of sold, if you will, as a way to help sales sell, that marketing is here to work alongside you around your goals from a sales and pipeline perspective, and focused in the same way you are on the same accounts and everything like that. But really, it involves change from both the marketing and sales side, and a reorientation of it's not marketing hitching to sales, say we're here to help sales sell. It's both marketing and sales getting on board that what we're really trying to do is help buyers buy. And so just as you talk about something needs to change internally, there's some sort of trigger or, change in perspective within an account. That's all part of the buyer's purchasing process, which is ultimately the deciding factor in whether or not they make a purchase, right, or make a decision. So both marketing and sales, I think, really need to change the perspective, especially as we were talking about with really, I think what's changed the game is the capability set. We're able now to get much more on the inside, of course, sales and personal representative, your brand representatives, your networks, your customers are all, that those personal contacts are still very robust and direct, first party sources of information about the state of affairs or what's going on, how people are thinking and what they're facing. But we have so much at our disposal now that really our job as marketers and sellers is to help buyers buy, understand where they are, and gather and put these signals to work. So I think that's, and another way, I think this connects back to the ABM one a little bit also, because I think the other thing traditionally with demand gen, it's capturing demand, it's one action, we got the hand raise or whatever it is. But we know that the decision is not linear. There are stops, stalls, shifts, of course, if you have long sales cycles, you could be looking very far out. So really responding, and it's not that marketing and sales have the same job. They have different roles and responsibilities, but they have the same goal. We're trying to do the same, ultimately after the same objective. So how do we work together with the insights that are captured from sales or revenue development efforts and from marketing efforts to shape the picture of who might be interested, what's changing, what initiatives are they after, how does that picture, so it's kind of an iterative picture that's being shaped, and of course is subject to change, even at the point where they're in, getting a demo or a POC or whatnot in conversation with sales. Of course, priorities could shift, changes in the team happen. So how can we work collectively to try to preempt or foresee some risks or change, to play defense on those deals that are progressed, just as, we're trying to get in at the right time and position appropriately to wherever they are in the journey. So I think it's a big mindset shift. Traditionally, I think there were kind of a division of responsibilities, that, well, we're responsible, marketing's going to take the lead with this part over here, and then sales would get involved. And while that's still true to some extent, that there's someone going to be in a leading role at different points, everyone has a vested interest, right, in the ultimate objective, and has a part to play, has insights to share onto how to guide the efforts of the team and complement the buyer best for where they are and for their preferences. If they want to engage via self-guided means, we're seeing that come up more and more with self-serve preferences, certainly also as younger generations are becoming a bigger part of B2B purchase decisions, incorporating all of that, right, and responding to buyer preferences, which is, again, something that ABM ushered forth, right? That it's how are they thinking about it? How would they speak about it? Where do they interact? That's the first question, right? That's the guiding light.
Yeah, and that couple of things you said there, which kind of linked to what we were talking about before we started the recording. I think a couple of things you said to me was that marketers need to change, and that everyone must become an ABMer. So with those two lines there, marketers need to change and everyone must become an ABMer. Is there any example you can share, anonymized, of where you see kind of that really working, that everyone is becoming an ABMer in an organization? Is there like a use case you've seen?
Yeah, I think the biggest changes in terms of, everyone becoming an ABMer, that was partly something we noticed with data that we gathered around ABM capabilities, really, and those working in ABM and the skills that were most important to them, or most important for them to have, things like strategic thinking, creative problem solving, communication, collaboration, project management. Those are very much reflected in the skill set that are going to be important for everyone working in B2B going forward. So it's to do with the competencies that have always been important to ABM becoming important for everyone, and also that audience-centric focus. Again, I think the silos have kind of been put up internally to say, well, I manage, just this channel or just this moment, right? And which, again, we need to take a more blended approach where there might be someone in the lead, but that it's a collective effort and a team sport really across the board, that there's not sole ownership at any stage. So taking that kind of audience first, buyer first approach, I think is something that the best ABMers have always done, right? And they were, sort of the advocate for the buyer across channels and across moments. So I think that sort of mission statement, if you will, or vantage point, is also something that needs to be instilled more in all shapes and sizes of demand and ABM teams. With marketing needing to change, we're working with a lot of clients on kind of making those changes, but also one of the biggest, as those working at ABM know, one of the biggest challenges is alignment and getting on the same page. Something I often talk to clients about is not, especially as they're starting or looking to, jumpstart a new effort or what have you, not putting it forth as a marketing thing, right? That marketing is taking care of ABM, but really to have an open conversation around looking at the business objective. What do we need to do collectively as a team responsible for revenue? What are the skills and competencies we have on our team? What audiences should we be focused on? That all of that isn't decided off in a corner and then circulated to say, oh, okay, we're doing ABM. Here's what it looks like. Here's what we need. But bringing everyone into that conversation, really critical for any transformation, right? To have it instilled and to have everyone have a piece of it. So I think the same thing is true from, marketing needing to change. It's not just about leads or about these sets of channels that we've always run. We're going to be guided by the audience. Maybe that involves different channels or touch points that we haven't traditionally invested in based on where we see them going for information or their preferences. So having that kind of mindset shift is, I think, a big place, really from kind of a change management or almost like coalition building perspective internally. That's where we see a lot of clients focus now, as well as restructuring their marketing programs to be more adaptive off of signals and insights. And sometimes, yet with the goal of collecting more signals, and it's, that it's not just about one direct action, but when we look broadly, we're trying to build engagement, to see, certain trends, to gain more information, especially if you're going after very large buying groups. Have we revealed a new place where there might be someone who's going to have a stake in the game or would be impacted and will need to be involved in making the decision? So changing the goals and the approach of marketing in the day-to-day also.
Well, that was a long answer to a short question, but there were so many things packed into there. But a couple of things I was just going to pull out, which I've made some notes here. One, obviously, what you mentioned about customer first approach. That's what you see from the best ABMers is the amount of time they spend with customers is extraordinary, and that's not something that typically marketers generally do. Spend time with customers. That's number one. I think number two, obviously, the fact that I think, from my conversations on this podcast and with the general market, most ABM managers and directors, they find it very hard to hire other ABMers. There's not a defined skill set out there really, and it's a very tough. I see all these posts on LinkedIn. Hey, looking for an ABM person, but it's not easy. It's not easy. And one of my most recent guests, Sloan Newman from NTT Data, he said that very often his best ABMers tend to come from agencies. Because they're the ones who are more commercially minded. They're the ones who tend to be out talking to customers. They're the ones who tend to have a revenue number against them. They're the ones who tend to be much more kind of like adaptive and flexible because they're jumping from one customer to another customer, and they're not just focused on one channel, as you said. So there's a lot of points to kind of break down in what you said, and so the audience will have to probably press play twice on that answer to get everything out. Let's talk about maturity. And one thing we talk about at our agency is about ABM maturity and how mature each company is with regards to ABM. And very large companies can be immature when it comes to ABM, and indeed very small, more agile companies can be much more mature when it comes to ABM. So it's not dictated by the size of the company or the age of the company, but just how experienced they are in ABM. But one of the things I think you were saying to me before was that you were saying that from your research, you see that a lot of companies still see ABM as being a digital play. And that's probably one of the reasons why ABM can get a bad name. Because of the digital element of it, the fact that if you rely on digital channels only, you're only going to have so much of an impact, etc. But why is that? What's happening that people see it, or a lot of people, as you said, see it as a digital play?
Yeah, I think it's very simple. We still see this. I still see clients and practitioners that say they're doing ABM, and what they mean is they're running programmatic ads to a target account list. And I think it's pretty simple. It's just that it's easy to do, right? If you buy a tool and you start using it, we're doing ABM. It's almost like a plug and play. So everything that we were just speaking about, and even to your point about the roles and responsibility, where where ABMers can come from. I guess I've seen that as well. In my practitioner experience and with clients that, I've seen those with a sales background come in and be really strong performers, or from an ops background. And that's why it's really much more about the competency, who has that kind of level of thinking and skill set, regardless of, where in the org that they would sit, or necessarily kind of what functional area they come from. But all of those things are hard to think about and take time, right? To really evaluate the competencies of your team, or what's needed, right? If there's further training or hiring that needs to be done. Just at, bringing everyone in. And I faced this as a practitioner too. I remember kind of, meeting with different sales teams and hearing a bunch of different things. So you have to kind of come in and say, well, here's what I'm hearing. If we look at the data, there is a difference really between, we see a quantitative difference in revenue potential from these audiences. So perhaps we should, or the feasibility, we see a large revenue potential, but we're really not equipped to capture it at the, to capitalize or really be able to help them realize value. And so being able to navigate those conversations obviously relates to the skills and competencies, but also takes time and takes difficult conversations or confusing conversations at times. So I think, why some are still investing in digital and calling it a day is because those things are hard. However, I will say, I wouldn't say that it's being seen that way. I'm talking to a lot of clients who are like, well, this is what we're doing, but we know that's not really how it should be, or we know that there's more that we can do. So I would qualify, I guess, that kind of statement by saying, while it's still happening, I think practitioners realize that they're leaving opportunity on the table, or they're not really capitalizing on everything that they could with that approach. I don't see it being kind of normalized that, well, this is that's just what ABM is.
Isn't that the definition of madness? Doing something that is not going to work and then continue to do it.
Right, expecting different results. Right, exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, I know. I mean, it's frustrating because we, when we talk to potential customers and we ask them about their ABM efforts, and very often, I mean, I think you've heard the same, that they might say, well, we do targeted LinkedIn, or we do LinkedIn lists, or we do coffee vouchers, or direct mail. And they're all marvelous, but they're just potential tactics, whereas it's actually not an ABM program or strategy. One thing you said earlier, Nora, which kind of just grabbed my attention, you said that the world's changing, people are changing, there are new channels. And I think two things you said to me. One obviously was self-service, which I think obviously we're used to that in the B2C world, but it's really interesting to hear that in the B2B world. Yeah. Self-service. And I think a couple of things. You also mentioned e-commerce, and then you also mentioned new generations with different ways of buying. And I'm pretty sure you said to me previously to this recording that there's something like 30% of the buyers were under 30, or I read that somewhere. But how are these events, self-service, e-commerce, these new generations who are different way of thinking, how will they impact ABM, do you think?
Absolutely. I think the biggest change that we see with generational shifts are, as you already called out, that move to self-service. So being self-directed in research, which doesn't necessarily mean uniquely digital, that you're only, going to websites or consulting digital resources, but that you're being self-guided in your conversations, also talking to peers or to others in, parts of communities and things like that. And being able to learn kind of on your own terms. I think that's something that will impact more and more ABM motion. I think, again, thinking traditional ABM, right? If you're just focused on, you're working with a major accounts manager and you're focused on a handful of accounts, sales really was almost like a gateway at that point. They were really the only way, that a buyer would have to go through, in order to proceed with a contract. And of course that still exists, as you talk about very complex deals and contracts, those are still predominantly, sales has a strong role to play. But even in those sorts of spaces, I think we predict that there's going to be more self-serve elements, in terms of learning about how pricing and packaging is put together, or being able to customize certain elements of what you would include in a contract. As an example, having that be a little more self-guided. And of course, there are some very large clients who are very used to, manufacturing is a classic example where it's really almost like an add to cart kind of motion, but with a very large revenue impact and scale. So I think that has always been the case a little bit. I mean, another example that stands out is when you're selling through partners, that's usually a big piece of the puzzle also for a strategic account kind of focus. So all of that is going to continue, but I think it's again a question of capability, almost like we were talking about before with the insights and signals now being so much more readily available and so much more personalized than they were traditionally, and that kind of field advancing. I think now the same thing, that the self-serve, the ways of interacting directly are broadening so much that it's now changing it, so it's sort of the changing capabilities that's changing what's possible and expected of us as marketers and sellers working with business buyers.
And the point around the younger generations who are kind of under 30s that are making a sizable percentage of the buying group or the filter group, what's your data showing there?
Yeah, what's something that actually stood out from it's not our most recent data, but a couple of years ago, we found actually that younger generations, which means when we talk about younger generations, we're looking at millennial buyers, which I think the oldest millennials are like mid 40s now, but they're largely identifying themselves as early deciders, which means when the time comes for them to make a purchase, they already know what they're going to buy. So that sort of ties into, our earlier conversations about seeding versus capturing demand, right? That it's not just about leading someone on a path, which would, I guess be in support of the you can't generate demand necessarily kind of point. But if there are buyers now that we're seeing are always learning, always interacting, that there's more of a role to play in that part, especially with the self-guided and digital touch points. So we're seeing those preferences shift, and they're happening admittedly different ways in different industries. But that's where we see that kind of headed.
Well, thanks, Nora, for that point around the millennials. I was just thinking that, unfortunately, I can't include myself in that group anymore. So clearly the way that I think and buy is clearly different to that. But I would say that I do make my mind up very quickly, and then with my own research, and then I do then contact the companies afterwards rather than let sales get involved. I try to avoid sales like the plague, and I try to make my own mind up, basically. Let's talk about making your own mind up, actually, with intent. One thing you said to me, because obviously you mentioned several times actually through this interview about intent, but one thing that you said to me about intent, which I thought was really interesting, you said that things are moving on a little bit with regards to intent, and very often it's not a question just of intent, but it's a question also of fit and good fit. And these signals are really important. So it's not just, and it goes beyond whether it's ICP or not ICP. Can you briefly share what you mean by it goes beyond ICP?
Yeah, I think a key piece to recognize is that, with whatever, an ideal customer profile or a set of strategic accounts, there's really a gradient or a scale. If you think about ideal or acceptable, right, those are fuzzy lines between the, and like we were saying before too, and where I see some of the most advanced clients and practitioners kind of operating is setting up a framework that kind of allows them to ratchet up or down depending, so to adapt to kind of a fluid environment where, you're going to either invest more or take a different approach with a higher fit versus higher engagement and sort of moving, because again, it's not a fixed universe really, especially as we talk about complex organizations with a wide array of offerings, which some might be more complex, strategic, large deal size, some might be more, smaller deal size, e-com kind of motion. So it goes beyond ICP, really, meaning that it's not just a black or white, a yes or no, are they in our ICP or not, but getting a sense of, well, what makes our best customer, and really, again, looking at the post-sale, who who's likely to retain and become advocates or really realize value from the solution, from how we're working with them, and can really kind of graduate to the level of strategic partner, kind of beyond the customer relationship. So getting that understanding, but then kind of understanding the variables that impact that. If we see, making up examples here, if we see they're working with a certain implementation partner that tends to have a quicker mean time to value or something like that, that's not a yes or no, right? It's not a go or no go kind of factor, but that impacts their ability to get started quickly in the process. So getting that kind of map, if you will, of fit, and making the decisions on where to draw the lines, where do we cut off and say, no, we're not going to invest in these audiences, no matter what we see in terms of them, shopping or, being in market for a solution. That's a moving target, really, based on the revenue goal, based on the resources, the budget and team and everything that's available to you. So setting up that kind of dynamic environment is really the next frontier.
Yeah, I love that expression, the next frontier. It's like a Star Trek
right
expression, ABM, the next frontier.
Yeah.
So a couple of questions for you about ROI and metrics. Number one, just, and it links really nicely to what you just said then. You're talking then about post-sale. And one of the things you were saying to me before was that lifetime value, LTV, is now quickly going to become the ABM metric, or one of the most important ABM metrics, as opposed to deal size, deal velocity, average order value, et cetera. Is that what you're seeing from talking to the market, from talking to customers, that LTVs, that post-sale is becoming more and more important with ABM?
Yeah, I think that's definitely where we see it headed. I think, in terms of being deeply entrenched in current measurement, I think there's only a few that are really getting there, but I'm seeing this a lot with clients and practitioners, even those that are relatively new to ABM or starting to establish an effort, asking about data and measurement, particularly through the lens of, well, how do we know that ABM is successful? Like, how do we know that these accounts or opportunities wouldn't have closed by themselves? So there's definitely still a kind of need to show marketing's value, right? What has marketing contributed to this equation? But I'm definitely seeing, I think once upon a time it was, well, of course, ABM is the best thing to do, and there weren't necessarily, but now I'm seeing, again, even though starting out, kind of coming out with that question, well, how do we know that this is creating something additive? So what we recommend at Forrester for all manner of B2B measurement is really looking at lift. What's the investment and the level of engagement that corresponds to a positive result. So we know not just that we're getting engagement, but we supported this level of engagement, which contributed to an increase in what, if you're looking at closed won revenue or looking at retention or whatever. I do think, and actually the vision report that I spoke about at B2B Summit, looking at the future of ABM, kind of made mention of this point where really the goal of the value of the strategic focus of ABM is not just about optimizing, as we were talking about, the demand and ABM sort of strengths, traditional strengths. It's not just optimizing to active buying cycles or deals that are likely to close. It's looking at a longer scale. And so when you look at lifetime value of customer, then you're really optimizing towards, again, not just pipeline right now, which is, of course, how sales tends to be thinking, right? If they're managing towards goals on a quarterly or an annual basis, but looking longer scale to say, how do we fill up the tank and invest in our customers that are going to be around 2 or 3 years from now, or have a high likelihood of retention, but also, value realization. And of course, I mentioned this earlier too, that gets also to an idea that we've pushed at Forrester as well in terms of buyers as partners. It's your customer kind of in a co-creation of value with you as an organization. So it's really orienting not just from a marketing sales kind of revenue pipeline perspective, but really from a sustainable, profitable growth business perspective. I think that's the real value of ABM's or the strategy, the strategic kind of vision of ABM infiltrating all of marketing and sales investments and approaches.
And talking about metrics, one thing you said to me as well with regards to attribution is, and I think I'm going to quote you correctly, you said, no one is happy about attribution. So from your many, many conversations with people, with the market, with companies doing ABM, what's the issue here and where do you stand on attribution and ABM?
Yeah, and I'm seeing, I'm sure you have too, I've seen more and more folks come out and say like, well, it's just bad. We shouldn't even be doing attribution, where I think there is a role for attribution to play on the activity side, particularly if you are managing an ABM program working across different channels and touch points, and you're saying, okay, for these audiences at these moments, are they more likely to engage in this or that sort of channel, or what's the relative performance? There is a place for attribution to play in that sphere, but it's certainly not what marketing's value or impact rests upon. So it's exciting, I think, to see that being reflected in the market so much. I think folks are really recognizing that, it's like just looking at a channel attribution or a last click or something like that is not telling the full story, especially if you're looking at a complex, buying group and a long purchase cycle. So definitely seeing recognition of that in the market. And I think we're starting to see changes there, just as I was talking about sort of the lifetime value being the ultimate goal. I think that it will take time to sort of orient businesses around that. And of course, there's always changes happening within businesses that, acquisitions and things of that nature that would change, the overall revenue goal or the makeup of the customers that you're trying to partner with and that you're after. So I think it will be a long process for organizations to embed that. And I think there's a lot of recognition also from the vendors and technology providers that, we need to level up on the measurement side. So it's a space, I think, where there's a lot of potential for change in the future. And it's good to see that I think people are interested in it, not necessarily just holding on to traditional measures.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I kind of hear from talking to guests is that very often it's the anecdotal evidence which is more powerful than the numerical evidence. And that the stories that they hear and share with their sales leadership or indeed with the C-suite about, what happened and what the client or potential client or future client said, those anecdotes are very often, those stories are much more powerful because, a CEO, these are not stupid people. These are very bright people, and they can understand the relationship between the events and the investment and an account-based approach, and indeed then what a customer will say when they're having a lunch or a dinner or you meet them at an event or whatever, and they can talk about that. So I'm hearing a lot more that people are leading definitely at the very beginning with those kind of anecdotal stories, and then maybe then they can have the more evidential numerical stuff to back it up down the road. And as you said, the LTV is clearly something that every customer would want to show. And I can't remember, I was talking to one of my guests and they were telling me that one of their oldest customer is 100 years that they've been with them. So you can imagine the LTV on a customer that's been with you for 100 years. So we would all like to have customers that long. 2 or 3 questions to wrap up with. One thing that's a passion of ours at the agency, we talk an awful lot about, is personalization. But one thing that I liked when we were speaking previously to recording this was you were talking about the importance of meaningful personalization. What do you, because everybody can use some technology and say, hi Nora, how's it going at Forrester? Anybody can do that. My 5-year-old downstairs can probably do that. But what do you mean? What do you think meaningful personalization looks like? What are your customers telling you?
Yeah, it's interesting, that example that you give, because I was struck actually hearing from a peer group of ABM practitioners that was, for a lot of folks, that's what personalization means. It's just saying, hi Nora, how are things at Forrester? Like that kind of simple, direct, like plug and play. Where really, if you think about customizing a message in terms of, it really runs the gamut, from industry or imagery rather to language that they're, if they're internal projects or initiatives that you're reflecting, the formats that they prefer to consume, if you're customizing the delivery, and the timing based on signals that you see, all of that really falls under personalization. Where the question of meaningful personalization comes in, I think, is that there can be, first of all, like diminishing returns on, if there are certain things that you're kind of spending a lot of time and effort to personalizing that don't really move the needle. Which is why there always needs to be a testing practice in every, program and channel and touch point to complement ABM. And it's something I often emphasize with clients too, that it's not that you have the engagement plan fully baked out at the start. Here's what we're going to run, for the next 3 months or whatever it is, but that you have hypotheses that you're testing and constantly reacting to changes in what you see. So part of that could be that there's, I've also seen it work, as we talked about my practitioner experience in demand and ABM. I've seen it also be kind of mutually beneficial, where there could be, if you're being hyper focused on a handful of accounts or a segment of accounts, and then seeing strong performers that, okay, well, could we test this to a wider segment? Does this have resonance across, to a broader industry? That again, there's kind of an ebb and flow between scale and personalization that is always changing. First of all, as we talked about the advent or the growing presence of self-serve, channels and delivery are always subject to change, and messages also, if people get exposed to a lot of things, they get tired of it, right? So it's constantly, it's a moving target and a moving picture. But finding, the balance between personalization and scale is, I think, what reveals what's really meaningful to our audiences, what moves the needle in terms of how they interact.
Yeah, I think it's a very fair point. I think we're definitely seeing people wanting to do some really meaningful personalization, and the reaction that we're getting from the market is that people want to move away from the kind of like generic personalization and move much more towards understanding the company, the people, the challenges, the agenda, what's keeping them awake at night, and trying to bring that personalization into the messaging and indeed into the solution. Obviously, Forrester is very well known for many of the surveys that you produce and release every year. The State of ABM 2024, I think, is one that you've been working on most recently. When's that due out? Hopefully, it hasn't come out yet. When's it due out? And
yes, it will. Happy to put a little plug. So yeah, we conduct a survey biennially, so every 2 years. Our last was done in 2022. We just got results back a week or two ago, so we're working on collating the results. It'll be a mix of compare and contrast, how have things evolved over the past couple of years, but also a snapshot of the challenges and approaches and opportunities that are standing out now, in terms of performance as well. We ask questions about the portfolio mix of organizations, of whether or not they hit their growth target. Are there trends that stood out from those who did? Those are all sort of learnings that we're looking to kind of pull forward as well from the survey results. So it will definitely be released by the end of the year. I'm assuming, my best guess right now is probably November timeframe. But yes, definitely keep an eye out for the findings there.
Okay, well, I'm sure you'll be doing big publicity on it, and I'm sure we'll join in and share that as well. Normally at this point now, I ask some rapid fire questions. Now, you can choose which hat you want to wear, whether you want to wear your Forrester hat, your analyst hat, or whether you want to wear your practitioner hat when you were doing ABM. But just some very rapid fire questions for you, Nora, just to finish off. Number one, what's been your greatest ABM learning?
I think what strikes me from the practitioner perspective, although I also see this as an analyst, is the relentlessness. I think the amount of time that it takes, and that you've never reached the summit. It's a never-ending play to adapt, react, preempt. I think that was something that really struck me when I was starting to really sink my teeth into ABM as a practitioner, and that I still see in practice with clients.
Relentless is a very good way of describing it. What would you believe to be the hardest part from your experience of ABM?
I think what we were speaking about before in terms of the kind of coalition building and understanding and level setting, building understanding and communication and buy-in with different teams. That is also relentless. It's not just that we had that conversation. We're moving on now. I think that's what I would say in response to the hardest part. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you turn your back and you think it's all done, and you find out that people are talking about ABM in a very different way to what you said, and you've got to go back and do it again. What would you say, linked to that potentially, is what do you think is the greatest misconception about ABM?
I think it's still, I still see a bit, and we talked before about the kind of digital nature. I think I still see that it's a marketing initiative and a marketing play, and that it's owned by marketing. Really, that it's a business, and it's a business strategy. It's a strategic objective, and it involves the entire revenue engine, from sales and marketing to customer success to revenue development. I think that's the biggest misconception.
Yeah. Now we're recording this, Nora, on a Thursday evening, my time, morning your time, or late morning your time. But imagine it's Friday, which is tomorrow, and you get you've had a hard week, and you're about to shut your laptop down and have a glass of something, or a Coke, or whatever your favorite tipple is, and one of your old friends calls you and says, "Nora, you've got to help me. I've been asked to present an ABM strategy to my CEO on Monday morning. Tell me, what must I include?" And you say, "Look, I'll tell you one thing, because I'm just about to kick back and relax for the weekend." What's that one thing you would tell them to include in that presentation?
Ooh, I think, and I spend a lot of time with clients on this as well. We spoke about it a lot in the beginning, but the business objective. What is ABM going to do for us? And usually there are many possible answers. But I still see clients say, "Well, we need to do ABM because it's the thing to do." And it's like, okay, well, why? Like which accounts, which customer, what's the business result going to be? Especially for an executive level audience, hooking into the executive view of growth for the organization, and rooting the approach in that is critical.
I think it's a great answer, and I think just trying to align it with what on earth does a business need to achieve, and then how is ABM going to help the business to achieve that. I think if you can align on those two, then you'll get a lot more people supporting you and cheering you on, as opposed to perhaps throwing cabbages or tomatoes from the sidelines, or whatever people throw. But Nora, you've been incredibly generous with your time today. Thank you so much for sharing so many insights from your own work, from the work you do at Forrester. And obviously we look forward to Forrester's State of ABM when it comes out later this year. So thank you once again.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really appreciate talking to you today.